Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. Today, a couple of updates, and then we'll get to today's participant. I'm excited to introduce you to. New book coming out. But first, let me talk about the Esalen retreat that Rodney Waters and I have coming up next year. Rodney Waters was interviewed in The Sacred Speaks many moons ago. And we're going to do a retreat at Esalen, a workshop at Esalen on, February 27th through March 3rd of 2023. The workshop is called Portals and Pathways, Ecstatic Experience, Music in the Red Book. Really stoked. It's going to be highly interactive, a lot of music and a concert and a deep dive into music of antiquity and the way in which music has been used typically for a long, long time in ceremonial spaces and ecstatic experience. So go check it out. There's a link below where you can look up the workshop. It's going to sell out pretty quickly. We've got a number of people already signed up, and so go check it out and sign up if you're so interested as soon as you can. Check that out at Esalen, ESALEN.org. And again, there's a link below to that particular workshop. Hope to see you there. Second, for updates, be sure to subscribe. It really helps. This project's growing, and your participation in it is integral. So if you're watching this and you enjoy the content, please subscribe. Right now, just take a moment, hit subscribe. Don't pass it up. Support, please. Thank you. The other thing is, this is the first. The episode that I recorded is recorded at my office, at my work office. This is my home office. And so it's a bit of a change up. I just want to let you know if you're used to seeing the recordings here. Okay, so I want to, of course, Modern Nations. Check out Modern Nations at modernnationsmusic.com. Hang out to the end of the episode, and you will hear a song called Clouds, theme song of the podcast. Thank you, guys, in Modern Nations. As always, check out Jung Houston, JUNGHouston.org. I'm really involved with the Jung Center here in Houston, and wonderful classes are offered all the time, at a distance and in person. So check that out. The Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. This podcast is sponsored by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative clinic that my wife and I started many years ago. And of course, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. I have Bill Brennard to thank for this episode. Bill, thank you for pointing Stephen in my direction. And he's got his book. I think it's officially out now. It's called How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. And read below and check out an overview of the book. But I want to introduce him, and then we'll get started. So Stephen Gray, check him out at stephengrayvision.com. Again, link below. And I want to read his bio, and then we will just jump in. Stephen has been involved in spiritual work and psychedelics for 50 years. This includes more than 20 years as a student and occasional teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, a dozen years actively involved with the Native American Church peyote prayer ceremonies, guest membership in the ayahuasca-using Santo Daime Church, and experience with a number of other entheogens. He is also the author of Returning to Sacred World, a spiritual toolkit for the emerging reality, and editor as well as one of the 18 contributors to the popular Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. Stephen teaches people about the spiritual benefits of intentional cannabis use and conduct cannabis meditations and sound journeying ceremonies. Perhaps most relevant to the mission of Stephen Gray Vision, for the past 10 years, he's co-organized the influential Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. That work has connected him to dozens of remarkable spokespeople on behalf of the skillful, understanding, and use of psychedelic entheogenic sacramental medicines. And the conference just happened, but check it out. It's the Spirit Plant Medicine. I know a number of people who went and loved it. So as far as anything else today, I think that does it. As always, check out The Sacred Speaks. Thank you for being here. Be sure to subscribe. And for now, we'll leave it there and enjoy the show. I'm eager to chat today. We have an interesting connection here. We have a lot of shared people that we know, mutual friends, mutual influencers, and mentors, and so on and so forth. Bill Barnard, of course, is one of the links that connects us. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, he wrote an essay or a chapter in your book. And I want to start off here by setting us up, because when I was thinking about talking with you, I was very excited about this overview in the world of psychedelics as medicine. And we have so many different levers we can draw from, but I'm mainly interested in your perspective and experience as a researcher, and how asking these questions and putting this book together in the way that you did has influenced the way that you think about these ideas, and who you are and how you show up in the world. So could we start off by an introduction with who you are? And then I want to spend a good amount of time talking about your process for the creation of this book. Is that a decent way for us to begin?
You can go about it any way you want, John. It's
Good.
fine by me. You know, I'll go any direction as long as you don't ask me to say that I like Jair Bolsonaro.
No, wouldn't do it. Wouldn't do it. You're on. Well, let's start there, man. Give us an overview. This you got a new book coming out, or is it already out? Have we? It's coming out soon. It's like next week, right?
Well, I think they said technically the publication date is November 22nd, but it's already shipped to our local bookstore here in Vancouver, Banyan. It's going to supply, who are going to have it ready for what we're calling a soft launch at our conference, which is coming up this weekend, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. So it's out there in certain ways, and the contributors have, I think, by now all received a copy of the book, because 3 of them have written me to say so. Yeah, so I think if somebody wanted to order it, they could order it now. I don't know if they'd get it immediately or how that would go, but this is the month of the book. Yeah.
Good. So yeah, and tell us about you. What sets you up to be the person asking questions about psychedelics and how they might be saving the world?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question, John. One way to answer it is that, I'll try to avoid going into my history particularly. It's not necessary, but I'm of the age group that sometimes are called the baby boomers. I never particularly liked that term applied to myself, but the more important aspect of that is that I came of age when there was an incredible explosion of interest in psychedelics and spirituality, in particular Asian spirituality, and I was interested in both of those, and so that was kind of the genesis of that in a lot of ways. And I think I was, if I may say so, born to be involved with spiritual work. I don't know, how many people believe in reincarnation and past lives and all that, but I'm fairly sure I've had connections to this kind of work in the past. So that was the way back kind of genesis. Perhaps you might say the trigger for, what led me toward this was about 11 years ago. A friend of mine asked me if I would co-organize this conference, Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, and that connected me. My main part of that work was finding and negotiating with or discussing with the potential or would-be speakers. So now I've got, this is our 11th year. So I've got 11 years of a couple of dozen people every year that I've connected with. And so that kind of, moved me along over the years. One of the steps, so to speak, along the way was Kathleen Harrison, ex-wife of Terence McKenna, and I had a discussion one year about cannabis and how it was being ignored or not really well representative as a spiritual ally while it's ubiquitous in the culture. And I said that I had thought of putting together a book, but I didn't feel like I had a whole book in me for it. And she said, well, if you put together a project like that, I'd contribute. And that was the trigger for me, because she's a beautiful writer and, has deep insight. So that one kind of, stepped along the way. And then just over the last 2 or 3 years, so this is probably the way I really want to answer this question. I hope I made that somewhat clear in the introduction to the book, actually. And then people like Chris Beisch. Chris said to me the other day, he's received his copies. He says, "Oh, I was surprised you put my chapter first, Stephen." He said, "When I'm in anthologies, I usually end up near the back because people think my ideas are kind of out there, And I wrote him back and I said, well, Chris, I put you there because um, you have the biggest view, in a sense, the big overview of what's going on here and where we're going potentially. And I wanted people to, kind of get get drawn into that overarching view right away. And so that's kind of what's been driving me for the last few years in a lot of ways, is this deepening awareness, and I guess you could say concern, although I'm trying to ride above that in some ways. Like Chris Killam, one of the contributors, says, the yogi rides the curl of the wave, or the edge of the top, or whatever. Trying not to worry about our future too much, but I do feel, or I do think that we are almost certainly heading into deeper, more turbulent waters, and there's an urgent need for clear, authentic, visionary voices to point out, however that can be done, that it's not just a tunnel to hell, but that there is this potential, not guaranteed at all, and certainly not in the near future, I don't think, for what contributor to the book Dwayne Elgin calls the birth of a mature planetary civilization, or Chris Bache himself calls the birth of the future human. And then when you, so from my point of view, when you kind of bring in all the different strands of information and insinuation, you might say, intuition, all that, it's a pretty strong picture, you might say. For a conference a couple of days ago, we interviewed Chief Phil Lane Jr. He's a hereditary native chief, originally from Kansas, living in our area up here near Vancouver. And he was saying that indigenous people all over the Americas, and perhaps other areas, yes, other areas as well, are connecting now, and they kind of all have the same understanding, which in many cases has been carried along for hundreds of years, that they predicted the coming of the Europeans, and they predicted that this is the time of the great transformation right now. So that's actually the overarching message of the book, or intention driving the book, I guess you could say, is that the psychedelics, it's not really just about the psychedelics. It's the, that my view, and I think probably the contributors of the book would agree with me, that the reason the psychedelics are getting this kind of attention in the book and in the cultures these days is because my sort of, it's almost like a personal cliche by now, is that when the patient is in an advanced state of illness, strong medicines are often required to, as you might say, shock the monkey, pull people out of habitual patterns, show them the truth about themselves and a larger reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bold title. I mean, certainly you're working with the idea of how a taboo and currently illegal substance might save the world, or a series of substances. And and you even made a note in one of your emails about this title, that you were kind of having feelings about it. It was my projection. I'm curious how you came to it and what you're proposing, what you're really going after with, and also talk about what the book is. I mean, let's let everybody know what the vision really is, and then we'll dive into some of the content.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a little bit hesitant to, pass the buck, as it were, on to the publisher, but in fact, it was their choice of title, and I actually had 2 Zoom conversations with the head of marketing at the publisher. I sent them 10 or so suggestions for titles. And they didn't really use any of them. They incorporated a few words from them. And so their first title, oh gosh, pardon me, publisher, don't mean to insult you, but their first title was How Psychedelics Can Save the World. It didn't have the word help in it. So I was never completely comfortable with that, but I also was getting feedback from a couple of people like, Stephen, some serious thinkers might, dismiss this for that reason, for the title. It smacks of, I don't know, like dogmatism almost, or sort of like Jesus saves or something, So I had this discussion with the publisher or with the marketing director, and at the end of it, I thought I'd convinced him to change it to how psychedelics can help transform the world. And then he said he liked that, but then he took it back to the marketing team and even the publisher, the founder or the owner of the company himself, and they all wanted the word save in there. So I just reconciled myself to that. But they did add help, and I think that makes a huge difference. It's just, in other words, it's they, if there's even a they about psychedelics in a sense, are one of the tools or some of the tools that can help with this. And as I said a few moments ago, perhaps certainly our most powerful tools in the short run. It's, as John, I'm sure you're aware, it's complicated, and just because even if you have an experience of satori or oneness or whatever you want to, however you want to describe that, there's certainly no guarantee that you're going to be able to integrate that back into as Houston, the great religious scholar Houston Smith used to say, or said at least once anyway, that what's more important than altered states is altered traits, right? Yeah. So that's kind of that, and I think I already spoke about the mission of the book in a sense is that, for all these different reasons and for all the different threads of information and inspiration that are coming in, it appears that we've kind of come to this nexus point, this incredibly dangerous but moment with immense potential as well. Another favorite saying of mine, I forget one of these is I've got two that I always like to trot out. One of them is by Victor Hugo, and I forget which one that is. It might be this one, which is necessity is the mother of invention, right? And the other one is my other favorite is there is nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So I would say that idea that we don't know who we are and we need to know who we are has come. It's kind of slapping us in the face, to put it mildly, at this point. And the exciting part about this moment that we live in, as far as I'm concerned, and many others, certainly not me alone, is that necessity is indeed the mother of invention. And as conditions deteriorate in multiple ways on the planet, there already is, and there will increasingly be incredible amounts of innovation and creativity applied to trying to remedy our misunderstanding and our overburdening of the planet, etc.
Well, and let's go there, because it seems like that is the overarching theme, that there is a problem. And would you, and I'm also holding on to this thread that you helped give birth to this plant medicine conference, and I want to certainly hear about that too. But so would you speak to that? Why now? Why psychedelics? What is the problem that it's trying to meet? The lack that it's trying to heal, and of course, then we can talk about all the problems with how we're doing that, how we're bringing psychedelics into the foreground. But let's start there. Why psychedelics? Why now?
Well. Yeah, well, for the reasons that I mentioned already on one level, that we've reached this point. Here's something that just popped up into mind. Sometimes I like to run with these little things, like almost an intuition or something. Yeah. Here's a way that you might look at the development of human history. And, I don't know if it's, exactly literally true in that sense, but let's just use it as a potential framework for a moment. Let's say that this planet was designed to be an environment. Let me just step one step farther back. Let's imagine that the creator or creators are great artists, and they're incredible creators, like scientists almost, and they're going, okay, let's try this, and let's try this, and let's try this. So this planet was you might imagine, as a design for an incredible environment of an extreme beauty, an incredible interdependent balance of everything connected, I mean, I always just, when I ever stop to think about it, I just consider this, this environment, this planetary environment, or the whole thing altogether to be a miracle beyond comprehension. Why do we have exactly the right amount, the right percentage of oxygen in the environment, in the air, for to live? If it was a couple percent more or less, we'd die, right? We'd all die. If the sun was any more, well, it gets any more intense, we might die, but that's another issue. And you go on and on and on how everything is connected. It's just a truly brilliant place. So in this kind of, maybe we'll call it a fairy tale for a moment here. The humans, or the beings of the planet, were originally meant to be able to explore a level of independent agency while still connected to who they really are, to the fact that they are spirit. We are spirit beings, shards of God, if you will, and so on. And so knowing who we are as divine beings, as Bill Barnard calls us, in the book. And then what happened was we got a little too good at it, perhaps you might say. We got too carried away with our individuality, our separateness, and over time closed off from that realization. And so without that realization, we became lost children and nervous children, you might say, not knowing who we are, trying to find a way to establish some kind of solidity and empowerment on this planet, which you might say is ego. And so ego got a little out of control, so to speak, and the dominators dominated, and, we have the last several thousand years of history run by mostly men, and men who have wielded power from an ego point of view, not from a compassionate or connected point of view, you might say. So that's one way of looking at what's brought us to this moment. That's probably not the only thing going on. There might be some other kind of inevitability. Things like the fact that we have 8 billion people on the planet and we're stressing the resources of the planet, beyond belief, et cetera, et cetera. But for whatever reason, excuse me, if I may, I'd like to bring up Chris Beisch here.
Yeah, great. I really loved that. And I've got his book on my desk as well, which I'll eventually be trying to chat him up. But that was a really solid essay. I loved that it was at the first. I fell right into that thing, man. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So he has this book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And it's commentary, and sometimes including even transcripts of the notes that he took during a 20-year period of 73 high-dose LSD sessions in the Stanislav Grof protocol, whereby you lay down on a couch or whatever with eye shades and a carefully curated playlist of appropriate music, and a sitter to make sure you don't, kind of get up and jump out the window or whatever. And LSD is a long-lasting substance, and of course, so you go through that over the course of a day, and then the next day you religiously transcribe everything. So he would actually put on the headphones again on the Sunday. He would do this on a Saturday usually. On the Sunday, he would then put his headphones on so that the music of a particular point of the journey would trigger the memories of that, and then write it all down in detail. So he did that 73 times, and the way he described it is that basically in every journey, the first 2 hours were really difficult as he died to different levels of his self-identity, his ego. First of all, the personal ego, and then even the species ego. And he said it was sometimes extremely painful to do that, but for whatever reason, he in particular was able to hang in and stay present with that. And then at a certain point, a couple hours later, he sort of burst out. I'm kind of using more my language than his at this point. He kind of burst out into what he has sometimes called the vast intelligences of the universe. and they started teaching him at different levels of power. He said it was extremely powerful. He said there was one where the energies themselves were so strong it took him a year to recuperate after one of these sessions. Wow. He said you had to, in his words, cohere at different levels. You had to be able to handle the power of that energy coming in, you know, and so. What they started to teach him in, I think, particularly the latter third or so of this 20-year period of these 73 high-dose sessions, 500 to 600 micrograms per session, by the way, was that we are indeed heading into what I think he calls a death and rebirth cycle. And as they got closer toward the end, they apparently became more confident that we are most likely to pull through it eventually. But it's not going to happen soon. It's it's something that is going to continue to deteriorate because basically, the death has to happen before the rebirth can happen, right? Mm-hmm. You would know, John, I imagine that's a kind of a trope that's been around for a long time, right? I think there are sayings from Jesus to that effect. You can't pour new wine into old skin, or mm-hmm. There has to be an emptiness, a dying out of what we're doing, and what we're doing, collectively at the moment is still on the wrong track overall in terms of who's running the show and what they're doing and where they're coming from. With all due respect to any individual human being, the governments and corporations still don't understand this. What we're talking about here. That we've come to this point, and they're slowly getting it, but essentially the message still hasn't gotten through to sufficiently for there to be the kind of change that needs to happen, really.
This is where I get into a weird. I mean, I know that I have this. I understand these narratives about there's a problem and we need cleansing. Uh-huh. What's funny to me though is that. You're probably the right person to talk to about this. Aren't we always? Isn't that always like? Couldn't we say that given the evolutionary nature of human beings, we're always mm-hmm. going to be in a state of flux, and there's always going to be need for cleansing, and we'll always be kind of. And what I like about Chris Bache's stuff is that it posits this, not just the problem, but that. Because he's gone through these experiences that a lot of people that experience plant medicine or psychedelic medicine, entheogenic medicine, they have these direct experiences, and it then, as a good Tibetan Buddhist might say, kind of you're then freed from the wheel of life and death. So where does that take us? That the universality of this dimension of kind of we are. This guy I just talked to, Walter Hanegraaff. He's talking about how the Greeks were looking at the Egyptians, and oh man, the Egyptians, shit, they had the good medicine, and then now we're looking at the Greeks, and then or the East, or indigenous folks, or that we're always looking to somebody else for the medicine, and isn't that a universal pattern? Any thoughts?
Not quite sure what the question is there.
Yeah, I mean, say more. I'm trying to get at. Anytime I ask somebody like, "What's the problem?" Yeah. Mm-hmm. We tend to need these narratives of, "Well, we've accumulated some perspective, or we've gone wrong, on this direction. We've gone too much this way, or not enough that way," and that there's something universal about that. Mm-hmm. So I'm pushing into this like. The time is now, yeah. As opposed to no, it's always now, and we are always in this space, and that there is something powerful, and because you do in your book, you have a lot of this like call to action around certainly the people who are navigating through what's happening with Earth, with our relationship to the planet, with gender, and our issue with power dynamics, and the way that. There's been an inequality in the balance of power and the ways in which we express our identities and create our cities and governments, and I mean, I'm with you. I'm totally in that. I think there are problematic issues, but the only thing I'm pushing into here is that isn't that something that we'll always be doing?
Well, I think it would be awful arrogant of me to think that I know the answers to those questions, but here's my best shot. And please, anyone watching or listening, it's just one
I
person's
love it. Yes.
view. Just one small person out of 8 billion. Excuse me. Yes, on one level, I agree. It's always now in that sense, but we've never stressed the carrying capacity of the planet before. We never had, 1,000 years ago. We didn't. What did we have? Like 50th of the population, 100th of the 1,000th of the population of now. I don't know. It just seems to many of us that all of these factors are dovetailing now for whatever reason. And yes, I know a cynic could say, yeah, that's kind of my generation or me thinking or something, or magical thinking that, yeah, there's something special about this particular time. And, that's perhaps something to be aware of, as a possibility. But I do think that there's so much information pointing to the fact that nothing in our history has piled up in the same way that it has now. 8 billion of us speaks for itself, right there. And then you have to, to get into the prophecies and all that. There has to be a willingness to suspend disbelief to some degree for the sort of hard-assed rational reductionists in the crowd, Well, let me just give you a very, very small example. I told you we interviewed this Chief Phil Lane Jr. a couple of days ago, and we were kind of almost joking about how so much of the connections these days are made doing what you and I are doing right now on Zoom, right? And he said that when he was a young man, I can't remember the context, he was sitting with some native elders down in Oregon, and this guy said to, sort of leaned into Phil because he knew he was going to be a future leader. And he said, by the time you get to my age, you're going to be sitting in front of a screen and you're going to be talking to people all around the world. This was back in the early 70s when none of this stuff existed, right? Computers took up whole rooms or whatever. Native peoples all over the world, indigenous people all over the world have felt the coming of the Europeans. They saw it as inevitable and actually part of the process, you might say. And they've been predicting for a long, long time that it would all come to a head now. So that, for me, there's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction in that regard. And then look at the climate. Yes, the climate changes on its own anyway, regardless of whatever humans do. But for whatever reason, it's going haywire. I don't know. Most people are, even if they're not paying attention, if they're not looking at the science, they may not even be aware of how dangerous the situation is right now, with melting glaciers and warming water and the sort of the connection, of feedback loops around the planet, climatically speaking. I think we're facing a lot of, we're about to face dramatically increasing challenges just on that level that we're only going to solve by coming together. So this is actually one of the central, what would you call them, archetypes of the whole issue is the recognition, and some of this can, perhaps bleed into the woo-woo for, again, the skeptics and cynics in the crowd, but I and many others believe that power of shared intention, if you will, that collective activity, that people getting together and applying their best ideas is going to be increasingly in the forefront as we go forward. So I suppose this was a somewhat roundabout and rambly way to answer your question. I just do think that qualitatively we're in a different place than we have ever been on this planet. And yes, ego has always been, if you will, the Tibetan Buddhists, as you mentioned a moment ago, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha taught that, the Four Noble Truths, the truth that we are suffering, and the reason we're suffering is because of our misunderstanding of who we are, and that there is a liberation from that suffering. So that's universal, that's eternal, always the case. But I would like to make the case that now we need a large number of people to fairly rapidly get into bed with that understanding, if you will, to embrace it, to begin to manifest it, to live it. And again, that's why the book, because as I said earlier in the conversation, when the patient is in an advanced state of illness, oftentimes strong medicines are required. In the case of psychedelics, certainly not for everybody, and certainly not the only path available or the only way, but at their best, when they're used, by the right people in the right circumstances and integrated back into the daily walk, they're probably unparalleled for what they can do in the way that they open us up.
Okay, so there's our diagnosis, right? One of the things that I heard in what you were saying is that our culture is sick, and that I can understand that. I really track it, because one of the things I do as a psychotherapist is I'm looking at certain belief patterns that have been introjected into the individual's perspective and live themselves out as almost autonomous beings that infect their perceptions and perspectives of their lives and the people in their lives. And that we come to the therapist and say, this thing keeps happening to me and I don't know why, and come to find out, oh yeah, I'm relating to my world as if this is true. And so the therapeutic endeavor is one that reframes, reconnects, dissolves whatever kind of autobiographical content might be wrapping that issue, and I can blow that up and say, okay, on a collective level, we would of course do this, except we might do it in a more foolish, dense kind of way, because the more people you add, the less brain cells you have, oddly enough, and so the culture itself is sick, and this is why I think, let's now move to treatment plan. Like, why would psychedelics offer a curative process for this sickness that now we can agree we all carry individually, just because of the nature of my existence and the traumas of my life and my birth, but also collectively because we have these systems of thought that have transcended my autobiographical experience, yet continue to have an influence on how I'm showing up on a daily basis. And in doing so, it's not really serving my broader, more expansive experience of being as authentic and real and genuine a human as I possibly can be when I'm playing out these old patterns from back then. So let's get into treatment plan. Like, why psychedelics?
Well, maybe we could call them reality medicines, maybe we could ditch the word drugs for now. Terence McKenna once said his definition of a drug was something that promoted habitual unexamined behavior. And from that point of view, psychedelics do not promote habitual unexamined behavior. What's his name? Tom Robbins, the wonderful novelist of many novels, including Still Life with Woodpecker.
Yeah,
yeah.
So good.
Anyway, in one of those books, he said, I think it was in a book, either that or an interview. It might have been an interview. Anyway, he said, I'm not interested in any drugs that make me think I'm better than I am. I'm interested in the drugs that help me dismantle any of that kind of arrogance, So the way I'd like to, propose the potential of psychedelics, perhaps, and again, it's just one way of looking at them, but might have some validity, is maybe you could think of them as having sort of two complementary approaches, if you will. One of them is can function as truth serums, and so they can they in a sense can show you, and there's immense amount of evidence to show that this is the case, with people who have used these substances therapeutically, ceremonial, and so on. They can show you, the sort of unconditional truth of who you are in that sense, individually, like in your own personal history, your own personal psychology. Different ones function differently. Iboga, for example, is sometimes described as pulling down a movie screen. When they work with Iboga and Ibogaine for addiction problems, people have described that it's like it pulls down a movie screen, and it literally, visually, almost in a sense, maybe visually, shows you the places where you left yourself, as it were, as a young child, perhaps, because of traumatic conditions that you were dealing with at the time. Gabor Mate talks a lot about that as well. How we all have some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder,
Yeah.
some degree of it, yeah, because to some sense we all turned away from our natural beings, our unconditioned divine beings. Again, using the Bill Barnard way of talking about it. So one of the functions of psychedelics, potentially, when they're used properly, safely, with good guidance of one kind or another, is that they can show you those places where you're wounded, where you have been wounded. And by seeing them, I would think, you're the expert here, in your field. I'm not in your field, but, simply by being able to bring things up, look at them clearly, non-judgmentally, then you can release them potentially. Maybe not necessarily immediately, but over time. MDMA, for example, although not actually truly a psychedelic, does exactly that, potentially, and which is why the organization MAPS and others are pushing it as for treatment for PTSD, that it has this kind of remarkable kind of tripartite capability of knocks out the fear factor, brings in the love or the compassion, and keeps your mind clear so that you can communicate with a therapist and you remember it. Unlike, say, a psilocybin or ayahuasca journey where so many things happen that you might remember the nub of it, but you're not going to be able to recount the main details, and you certainly don't want to be talking about it while you're under the influence of of the substance generally. It's MDMA. For example, my wife and I did MDMA once together. We didn't do it for therapeutic reasons particularly. We did it, well, I guess you could say, to connect with each other more. But we had sort of individual experiences, and she had this experience where it wasn't on her mind at all. She didn't even know it was an issue. But her mother died from cancer when she was 13 years old. And when she saw into the fact that she was still carrying anger now at the age of 60 about her mom, because she felt like her mom gave up on life. She never realized her potential. She was a creative person, but she lived the life of a 50s housewife with 6 children and never really rose to her potential, got cancer and died at the age of 55. But under the influence of the MDMA, that anger that Diane felt was surrounded, almost embraced, you might say, by compassion. So there wasn't really any anger. It was just the recognition that she'd been carrying the anger. So the psychedelics have that kind of potential to show you the places where you've stopped yourself, limited yourself, and so on. And the other function, if you will, not really separate, I don't think, but the other capability that they have, I would say, is they can also show you what surrounds all that. What Buddhist teachings might call unconditional reality. They can drop you into the connection, the fact that you are connected. This term oneness that comes up so much. It's not an airy-fairy or abstract concept. It's a real experience that people can have, and ideally, that's where we need to go. In terms of we're talking about treatment collectively, is the recognition that we are connected to everything, that we are embedded in everything, that there's an interdependent interconnection going on, that we have separated ourselves. That's what I was referring to in my fairy tale from earlier in the conversation, where we just got too disconnected overall. These are generalizations, of course, but as a species, for the most part, over the course of history, we became so isolated, in a sense, from our connection to the divine, to the Holy Spirit, the Creator, whatever you want to call it, And so now is the time where there's no more wiggle room anymore. The flatland days, you may say, are over, and because of the unprecedented dovetailing of all these conditions, that it's pedal to the metal time, you might say. Right, so the treatment plan, if it involves psychedelics, is take them in the most efficacious conditions possible. Recognize that they can dissolve you out of your habitual patterns. Don't judge whatever comes up. That can be create what's called a bummer oftentimes. Terence McKenna once said he thought the 60s were largely misplayed because people took these substances that have this potential to haul you out of your habitual patterns, which is ego death, in its extreme or ultimate way, and that's terrifying if you're not prepared for it. And so most people, back then, he was saying, never wanted that to happen, and were just sort of glad to have survived, a skirt along the edge of ego death. He had a favorite saying, which it wasn't his, but I always liked it. He said, he's like, we're whistling past the graveyard, right? This is kind of the human condition, in a sense, you might say, that the graveyard meaning ego death, that Buddhists have analyzed this, to the nth degree, that the self that we identify as the self doesn't exist. It's an illusion. It's a collection of stories, concepts, dogmas, beliefs, that we've put together. If you want to really get into that, study Tibetan Buddhism, because they've got thousands of pages on the many layers and the ways that we do that, have done that, skandhas and all these different things that they talk about. But basically, it's what we identify as ourself, generally, from the ego angle, so to speak, is it doesn't exist other than in this collection of stories. And so what the psychedelics, again, can potentially do is pull you or drop you out of those stories and show you something that's real. That's why I started this by saying I'd like to see them as reality medicines that way.
I like that. If we take this line of thinking and still push it further around our culture being sick, I think of how much influence you have, both leading a conference that's working with plant medicine, also writing this book. You have a number of people that are speaking from the perspective of the indigenous traditions, and if our culture is sick, and we have no structures in place to help support these kinds of alternate states of consciousness and alternate forms of knowledge, we tend to borrow from other cultures. But what do you see happening regarding what is going on with this dominant capitalistic, monotheistic, democratic, materialist lens and what we would call indigenous forms of knowledge and experience? Can you comment on that?
Oh yeah, there's a couple of books in there, John.
Good. It's a big question for me, man. I'm thinking about it all the time. I even thinking about it from a parenting perspective. It's like, we're trying to figure out how to parent children and also work two jobs and, be all the things we do outside of community because we're part of this individualistic worldview. So yeah, just take that and run with it. We'll see where we go.
Yeah. Oh boy, yeah, there's a lot of ways to talk about that. And again, please, anybody watching or listening to this, don't take me as an authority. It's just one person's understanding or even attempt to understand, you might say. So, I have to confess to being an idealist in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the great philosopher Yogi Berra, you know who he was?
Sure.
He was the accidental philosopher,
I like his
and
stuff.
he said, more or less in these words, I'm not sure if I remember the exact wording, something to the effect of, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else. And the reason I mention that one is because without a theory, without a vision of what's possible, then you might end up somewhere else, basically. So in that sense, I would again confess to being an idealist in the sense that um, I like to entertain visions of what's possible. As Desmond Tutu, the great bishop of South Africa, said, most people's problem is they don't believe in the possibility of possibility. And excuse me. So here's one possibility. You were referring to, the dominating capitalistic model that's been, in a sense, running the world. I think it's upside down in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a complex topic, and that's why I say I don't want to get, I'm not an authority. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but there's something fundamentally upside down about the fact that, say, our basic needs are controlled by people whose main publicly confessed motivation is profit. Um, that's the model. Profit for the shareholders, profit for the company, profit for the CEO, et cetera, et cetera. It's based on a debt model. It's based on a scarcity model. It's based on a competitive model. It's based on a fear model. It's based on an ego model. It's based on a lack of trust in ourselves and each other kind of model. In contrast, and again, and let's make this really clear, we are not idealizing indigenous cultures. They've all had problems, and especially if you look at them today. But the reason that they're in tatters today is because those cultures have been disrupted and destroyed, mostly. There were, when those cultures were intact, many of them, they had an understanding. For example, okay, let me maybe go into this one a little bit. There was I think it was in the 1870s. There was a bill in the United States Congress that was passed called the Dawes Severalty Act, DAWES, and I think the guy's name was Henry Dawes. And what it was that he said something to the effect that, referring to the Native American people, he said, these people have no future. They don't own things. So what the Dawes Severalty Act was doing was really an excuse to give land to the settlers. But what they did, if I've got this more or less correct, is that I haven't thought about it for quite a while now, but they sort of took control of what had previously been considered indigenous or native land, and then allowed them to have it back if they were an individual and they got a plot or something. They wanted them to become owners of their individual plots of land in that sense. So I remember reading a quote by a Native woman who said something like, you people have your, all your different things to protect yourself and all that, but what we have is we have relationships, and so ideally, in the best, kind of purest sense or way that this has happened, is that economic relations are based on generosity, collective trust. Generosity and collective trust is one way to put it. Have you ever heard of Martin Prechtel?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he's amazing. He's a wonderful writer from my point of view, and he has a number of fantastic books, in my opinion. I believe the first one was called Secrets of the Talking Jaguar. The short version of his story, if I can do it justice, is that He was half Hopi and half Finnish, like one parent from Finland, grew up on a Hopi reservation. And the story is very interesting how he got there. But the short version is that he ended up in a town in Guatemala called Santiago de Atitlan, where a couple of days later, the most famous shaman of the area walked up to him and said, "About time you got here, Curly." He said, "I visioned you into this place because the junta are coming in about 10, 15 years. They're going to destroy whatever remains of our shamanic cultures and so on. I need somebody who understands this work to train and replace me because I'm near the end of my life. And it is you. And then you're going to take it away, take this understanding away." So he was trained by this guy, became the village shaman and a whole bunch of other things. I think he headed the local government for a while even. Was there for 13 years. And sure enough, one night the villagers all showed up and said, "Martin, you got to go now because they're coming." And so he split and went back to the States and started something called Boland's Kitchen and so on. Anyway, he said that generosity was the highest virtue or value in their culture, absolutely number one. And they would do things, you've heard of the potlatch, I'm sure, up here, in the Northwest. The native people of the Northwest have had these potlatches where they give everything away for certain special reasons and so on. In that town, in that culture, Martin said, somebody would just sort of out of the blue just invite everybody over and just have a giveaway. And give away everything they had, essentially, But nobody worried about it because that was the attitude. Like, if you need it, you can have it. So if you gave away everything, I know that's what I mean. I'm a confessed idealist here because this is a radically 180-degree difference from the way we run things now. Yeah. But look at the results or the effects that this culture has on us. The amount of stress that's created just trying to keep ourselves, above ground financially. You have to protect yourself. You have to, if you have money, you have to, you want to have all these security things, and you have insurance, and and so on and so on. And it's everybody for themselves, or you and your family against the world in that sense. It creates an immense amount of stress and fear in a lot of ways. What if? Okay, I have to do a slight tangent here. One of the contributors to the book, Tyson Yunkaporta, who's amazing. Oh, I love him. He's got a book called Sand Talk, which I just love. Subtitle is How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. I think the publisher came up with that subtitle. Anyway, he mentioned, I'm not sure if it's in his chapter or in an interview I did with him. I have a YouTube channel, Stephen Gray Vision, where I interview people like this. And
link
Tyson,
below.
What's that?
I'll put the link below for people to click on that.
So Stephen Gray, all one word, and then Vision, and it's STEPHENGRAY. Anyway, somewhere Tyson mentions something called the Dunbar number. Have you ever heard of it, John?
That scratches an itch, but I can't recall.
Yeah. Well, supposedly it's around 150 to 200 people, and it's said to be the maximum number of people you can have in one physical community, and still keep things sane. For like if somebody starts to get out of control, ego-wise, power-wise, the community's there to deal with it. If you start to see sexual predation, the community is there to deal with it. And so he says, well, of course, people are going to then object and say, well, that's not scalable. Communities of 150 to 200 people. And he says, but he does this much more eloquently and in detail than I'm saying here. But he said, no, it's not like that at all. He said, there's an immense amount of connection, interconnection, and even interbreeding, actually, learning from other nodes, if you will, So, and in fact, I think, not necessarily by design, but by survival necessity, that's the way many indigenous communities have worked in the past. If you imagine small tribes all over the United States, for example, you couldn't marry your daughter within the tribe over and over and over again, right? You had to have relations with other communities and, bring fresh blood in and send fresh blood out and all that kind of thing. So they did have communities of roughly that size in many parts of the world, in fact, with a lot of interconnections. You ever, what's his name, Bruce Chatwin? You ever heard of the Song Lines?
No.
Wonderful book about Australia, and the Aboriginal people of Australia. The song lines were these lines of communication that went all across the continent, big continent, Australia, right? And you would find beads. I mean, these were people that only traveled by foot. And, I don't know how far it is from the northwest corner of Australia to the southeast corner of Australia, but it's probably a couple thousand miles. And you would find beads at one end of that line that were also found at the other end. They were trading all across that continent and sharing wisdom and information and everything like that. Even though they lived in small units. So in terms of a treatment plan, I know this is idealistic. How do you take a city and break it down into Dunbar units? I have no idea. But, this all sprung from this notion of generosity, because if you can bring it down to these small kind of communities, then people can have direct economic relations with each other. People might be interested. I haven't read it for a long time, so I don't remember the details, but Charles Eisenstein has an interesting book called Sacred Economics that addresses that issue. It came out about 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah.
That sounds like a good read.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what happens, though, in these small communities? You're known, you're seen, you're held accountable. Mm-hmm. It's like pack training, you're able to, which is true. I mean, even the work in attachment was that when we're in a community, we naturally kind of can onboard our, the intrinsic aspects of our healing, of our communication. So, okay, we have small communities, and then we have entheogens, or reality manifesting substances. Mm-hmm. And that, what I'm hearing you say on some level, is a reset. Mm-hmm. Right? It's that the culture knowing, if we could speak, the culture knowing that these are inevitabilities just because of the nature of life and the way we function, creates this religious container around a sacramental substance that gives you moments of egoless awareness. And that we begin to recognize that reality is beyond what we perceive it to be. And our culture doesn't really have a container for that. So what does the indigenous wisdom tell us that we're needing? Because I think on some level, what the problem, we can't borrow from other culture, right? That's kind of an empty approach. We can certainly learn from, and we can trade and share stories and bond and ask questions about what they do, what we do. It needs to come from within us. So what does that even begin to look like, do you think?
Well, again, under the guidance of Yogi Berra, if you don't have some vision of what's possible, then you don't even know what you're doing or what to work toward, in a sense, right, or what to pay attention to. So, the idea that we actually understanding, it's not like it's a rocket science concept to consider for your quote average human being, is that one doesn't need to know the sort of the historical development of all this particularly, but you could accept perhaps the notion that over the course of history, we in the sort of what we might call dominant cultures, or whatever you want to call them, the West as an idea, so to speak, have been taught this notion of separateness, and so that's who we think we are. You and I both talked earlier in the conversation about collections of stories and so on that we put together and create this what people call the false identity. One of Sigmund Freud's proteges, Otto Rank, called it the false personality, or the lie of personality, right? We put this stuff together to survive in the world. Excuse me. So, oh, sorry. I forget what the actual question is now. I'm kind of going off into.
Well, we're talking about the dominant culture, and you're offering up the sense of separateness, because we're saying that
Yeah.
Obviously we can project onto an indigenous community easily, but really what I'm trying to get at is what if our culture, let's just speak, right? Because our culture's sick. How do we create healing? In what way do you envision psychedelics could be used to treat what is sick in our culture? What does that look like? Because it's not necessarily a Maloka in the jungle or the rainforest. What does it look like here, do you think?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I mean, I've spoken already about this sort of twofold notion of, truth serum and, opening one up to what you might call unconditional reality, so that we do understand, at least in that moment, that we are connected. People that work with psychedelics talk a lot about how it connects us to nature and so on. And we realize that we're not part of nature, or we get increasingly in love with the majesty and the brilliance of all of nature, which we are also just as much a part of nature as anything else in that sense. And so, yeah, how does that look like in our culture? Well, that's a big question, and I certainly wouldn't want to sound like I'm the authority on it or anything like that. I think it probably is sort of in the ballpark of, as you mentioned, learning from other cultures. For example, I spent 12 years going frequently to Native American church peyote prayer ceremonies, and I've been around quite a few different containers for spiritual practice with and without medicines, including Tibetan Buddhism for a long time. And I've done probably 2 or 3 dozen ceremonies with the Santo Daime people, the syncretic religion from Brazil that Bill Barnard is connected to, for example, that works with ayahuasca. They call it Daime. And so I've seen lots of containers, and they have a really good container as well. But the Native American church peyote prayer ceremonies, of my experience, have an amazing container. Everything in that teepee for that night is about keeping the door open for spirit and truth to come in. Everything. The only rules that exist are for that reason. And they say that when everybody can get their minds in one place, in other words, get out of their heads for the most part, then the spirit actually does come into the teepee. But the old roadman Ken Littlefish, who ran a lot of those meetings, he said it's like a deer. It's like a frightened deer almost. It'll come in there, and if there's too much, traffic, so to speak, head traffic going on in the teepee, boom, gone. But he said, when you can get a group of people together that can get out of their heads and into their hearts and into this space of emptying into the presence, so to speak, that spirit will come in and people will see it. They may see it like as a little light. And, in the morning you say, I saw a little light come into the teepee, and someone else will say, yeah, I saw that light around the same time. It kind of goes like that, right? So I think the key for bringing these kind of medicines into our culture is understanding the power and the depth and as the spirit. There's a fellow who said, we already have a full roster of speakers for our conference, but one of the native people from this area has been a spokesman for his people for a long time, is a guy named Reuben George. And he said, Chief Phil Lane said, if anyone has to cancel, Reuben would be great. And what he would speak about is what's missing with psychedelics is the understanding of spirit, the connection to spirit, right? So it's not this sort of mechanistic, physiological kind of thing on one level. It's that there's a spirit. I know that's a big loaded word in a way, but there's some kind of spirit involved here, and it's the connection with spirit. Ken Littlefish, the roadman I just mentioned, he said, relatives. That's the way they spoke to each other in the teepee there. He says, relatives, I want you to know something. When I'm running these meetings, he says, when I take that peyote medicine in these meetings and I'm running these meetings, he said, the spirit talks to me and it tells me what to do. And he said, I mean that literally. The spirit tells me, pay attention to this person over on this side of the teepee. He's having trouble. Say a prayer for him, sing a song for him, bring him some extra medicine. Take your feather over there, and or your sage or whatever. Somehow, I think people need to understand that with, not every, some of the synthetics or semi-synthetic medicines, they don't necessarily. I don't know. I'm above my pay grade a little bit here, but I don't think they necessarily have, a spirit behind them, as it were. But they can open you up to the guidance that exists, so to speak, you might say. But certainly, it seems like the ones that are plant-based do have those kinds of connections. Kat Harrison talks about. Kathleen Harrison, she's spent 30, 40 years. Working with indigenous peoples in Central America and Hawaii and places like that. And she said all those indigenous people that she's known all essentially have the same belief, which is that every plant has a mother. She said some mothers are strong and some are weaker, but they all have a mother. So it's almost like you connecting with the mother of that plant. Or Michael Stewart Ani in the book talks about the talking plants, he said. It takes a lot of skill. It's not an easy thing to be able to connect with the talking plants, as it were. Certain ways that you have to think and do, and takes a lot of experience and guidance from people that know what they're talking about, which perhaps also comes back to your questions about learning from indigenous wisdom, because those people oftentimes do have that understanding in a way that, this is a generalization, John, but, here it goes anyway. I've heard this from a number of different people from outside of these sort of, whatever we call them now, mainstream cultures or dominant cultures. Ken Littlefish said to me one time, he said, hey, Stephen, I don't mean this in any judgmental way. It's just an observation from decades of living. And he said, is that in general, the native people that I'm hanging around with and that I know, their minds aren't as busy as you European-based people, right? And I've heard that from other people, like a friend in Thailand who's from here, been living there for 20 years. He said his Thai friend said, you Westerners, you just think too much, And so, excuse me. And then these are all just little anecdotes, all kind of, roughly pointing in the same direction. Another person from that Native American church world was Susie Hawk. She and her husband ran a lot of meetings, and sometimes they used to come up to Salt Spring Island here in British Columbia and run meetings for a group of non-Native people on one of our local islands here. And I went to one of them, and Susie was at that one. And she said to me one time, she said, and if I could give you some background on Susie, I don't want to take the time to do that, but she's a person who's very connected to, the veil between the material and the spiritual was extremely thin with her. She was aware of beings around and that kind of thing. Anyway, she said, really difficult for her to sit in the meetings that were run by the non-natives because they're singing these prayer songs throughout the night. She said, if they don't, then and everyone gets to sing the songs. It's like that. The instruments get passed around the teepee, and if you know the songs, you sing a set of 4. So it's not like there's just one person like the shaman up at the front doing that. She said, if you sing those songs and you don't know what you're doing, if you don't actually understand the spiritual power behind those songs, then you're creating tangled energies. And she said, it's very difficult for me to sit in those meetings with those people because there's all these tangled energies, moving around in the teepee, So I think somehow we need that depth of understanding. For example, in the ayahuasca world, traditionally in the mestizo world of the upper Amazon, the apprentice would study for years, and they would do things like they would go into the forest with a plant, a master plant, and spend perhaps weeks, a month, even more, alone in the woods, just simplifying their diet down to next to nothing, just like rice and plantain and no salt, sugar, alcohol, coffee, no sex, nothing. And then they'd take a plant with them and these plants they call the master plants, right? And there are many, dozens of them perhaps, and they get to know that plant. They take it as a tea or whatever, and then they oftentimes connect to it through incredibly lucid dreams that actually teach them. And so I did a ceremony near Iquitos in Peru one time years ago, and the shaman there, the ayahuasquero, had 8 bottles of bottles that were sort of like larger water bottles, plastic water bottles filled with these dark, viscous-looking liquids. And somebody asked him, "What are all those liquids on your little altar there?" His name was Percy Garcia. And he said, "Oh, well, when I was younger, I did diets, they call them dietas in Spanish, with each one of the plants that's represented in liquid form that's here on my altar." And he said, "When I start every single meeting, the first thing I do is I thank all those plant doctors." And he said, "They then come and work with me," right? So we get these, so the potential problem here in our cultures is that we get all these people that, here's the worst case scenario. You do an ayahuasca ceremony up here or down in Peru or wherever, or you go down for a couple of weeks and you maybe do 3 or 4 or 5, and you come back and you think you know something, right? And then maybe you go down again a few months later and you stay for a month, and some sort of dubious self-styled shaman says, "Oh, I think you're ready to be a shaman yourself." And then you go back and now you start building yourself as a shaman. But you don't understand the depth of what you're doing. You don't understand that spirit connection. You don't know what those songs can do. If I may just ramble one bit more, maybe just
Please.
to kind of drum it in. Another ayahuasca ceremony, or I did 3 ayahuasca ceremonies with the same shaman in this area outside of Iquitos. And the second of the 3, they were like 2-3 days apart. The second of the 3 was the most powerful ayahuasca ceremony I'd ever experienced in my life. And I was up all night. Like usually you can fall asleep by about 3 in the morning, but I was up all night. In the morning we had a sharing session, and they were going to be doing another one in 2 days. And I said, "I don't think I'll come back for that one. I think I got about 6 months worth of work to do here." And the guy said, "Well, come on back anyway." He said, because I told him a bit about what I felt my obstacles were. And he said, "Come on back anyway. Even if you don't drink the medicine, I've got a song for you." So I ended up getting an amazingly good sleep that night, on the Thursday night at home. And I felt really refreshed. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go back and maybe I'll take a small amount of medicine. So I go back and I took about 1/3 of the amount of medicine, of the liquid, that I had on that previous one. And, once the medicine is kicked in, they invite each of the participants to come up and sit in front of them, and they light a mapacho cigarette that they pray with, and then they sing you a song. They call them Icaros. So like 1.25 hours in, I hadn't experienced anything really. Just this really, really, really light buzz, but really sweet, really gentle, nothing, no visions, nothing. And I thought, oh, this is lovely. I'm going to have a night off. I'm going to be able to get to sleep about midnight. It's all going to be lovely. So I go up, sit in front of the guy, fires up his mapacho and sings me a song, an Icaro. As I'm walking back across the Maloca, I start to notice something. And by the time I'm sitting down on my cushion again, or my mattress, within about 2 minutes, it's gone from essentially nothing, like a sort of a 0.1 out of 10 or something, to an 8 out of 10, almost as strong as the one from 2 nights before that, on 1/3 of the medicine. And in the morning after that, I said to him, "What was that? Did that have something to do with your song?" And he said, "You damn right it did." He said, "Those songs are beings. Those are spirits. And they come in and they say, I'm the song for this moment, for this situation, for this person," right? So if you don't understand any of that, working with these medicines, how the spirit, how essential a connection to the spirit of the plants is, or some kind of connection to the muse, or whatever you want to call it, you're missing a huge component of what makes you a skillful ceremony leader. And then perhaps to wrap up, the question, I think ceremonial work here, borrowing ideas, but really working hard if you're the one leading them to make those connections and do your own work. Obviously you would know this as a psychotherapist, John, You have to be doing your own work. Otherwise, you're starting to project your own problems into the situation. If you've got power needs, if you've got money needs, if you've got sexually unresolved issues that you're not clear on, all that stuff can, because as, the old cliche goes, and it is a true one, obviously, is that power corrupts, right?
Yeah.
So it's, as soon as you have people looking up to you, whoa, watch out, buddy. Do your own, do your work, do your inner work. Yeah.
Well, this actually brings up a good thread, Stephen, is that what are the problems that in all these conversations that you're having, what are the issues of what psychedelics are bringing online in our culture?
Yeah, oh boy. Yeah, that's another, you just opened another Pandora's box there, John. I don't know how much longer you have or how much energy, for this I have anymore either, but I will do my best at that one. Oh, okay, so the capitalist model is a problem. Do you know who Daniel Pinchbeck is?
Yes.
Yeah, he's kind of controversial. He's had his own issues with some of that stuff, but I just saw one. I get his newsletter.
Yeah, I get it too.
I don't actually pay for it, so I don't get to read the whole thing. I always get to a point where it says subscribe now to read the rest of it. Anyway, his latest one this week, which I didn't read, was Psychedelic Capitalism Sucks, right? Yeah. So yeah, when it's being dominated by that same mentality that, has been driving the world, the profit-making, profit-taking, competitive, model, as the highest priority, then it's just going to get to applied to whatever field it is. And in this case, it's psychedelics. So that's a problem. Another problem that people have addressed, and many people know far more about this than I do, is the potential for what you might call bureaucratic medicalization of these substances, that if they're only controlled in terms of their entry into the legal market, if they're only controlled by, the old boys club, as it were, then that's potentially a problem as well. Coming back to the capitalist corporate model again, I think there's potentially a problem. There's actually, I haven't made a big study of this, but I've heard just little hints, to give me the sense of it, is that there are people, pharmaceutical companies that are trying to, two things actually. They're trying to come up with like modifications of the chemical configuration of some of these substances so they can patent them. But I think, again, this is sourced in a deep, deep misunderstanding of what they actually are, and this, especially the sort of spirit component or spiritual component of this. So that's one problem there. And the other one is they're also, as I understand it, research going on to try to find, they're trying to figure out that could the medicine be effective without the psychoactive component,
right? Without the
psychedelic component. And I think that's also sourced in a deep misunderstanding. We just had I just found out that, or just heard on the news that there was an initiative, or whatever you called it before, Health Canada, to approve psilocybin therapy for depression. Mm-hmm. And they sort of rejected it, not completely, but they said they would only approve it if all other modalities had been tried first, including the one that they focused on was electroshock therapy. And I'm thinking, okay, you're putting electroshock therapy. I mean, I'm not an expert. I don't know. I know electroshock therapy's come a long way in the last 50, 60 years in certain respects, but still, you're telling me that electroshock therapy is in the same league and category as psilocybin therapy? Mm-hmm. That, to me, again, speaks of a deep misunderstanding. Electroshock therapy, pardon me, you probably know a lot more about that than I do, John, but my sense of it is it's going to shock you in a sense, or, get a reset going there. But is there any way that it's actually going to give you insight into yourself? It's assuming, it seems to me, that psilocybin is a mechanistic sort of a medicine, that it has this physiological only impact on you. But if you talk to the people that have taken it for depression and other things, similar things, they tell you it's what it shows you about yourself and about your embeddedness in this larger reality that changes you. You know, um, you see films like Fantastic Fungi, where they, the work that they show near the end of that film, they interviewed a couple of the people that were in some of these Johns Hopkins studies.
Yeah.
And, in the Johns Hopkins work, for example, with, terminal cancer people and so on, the ones that changed their attitude about their condition the most were the ones who had the deepest mystical experiences. Like that's a reliable finding from those sessions, was that the people that reported having a powerful mystical experience were the ones who dramatically changed their attitude about their life the most, right? Yeah. So again, this is what needs to be understood. So there's the pharmaceutical corporate capitalist problem. There's the perhaps somewhat related over medicalization or bureaucratic control of them is a problem. This problem I mentioned earlier about people thinking they know things. We had a joke. I'm sort of from the hippie generation, and people were starting from scratch to do things like how to build a home and all these things. And I was living up in the country for a couple of years back then, and people were learning all these skills for the first time that other people had known for thousands of years. So we had a little joke: if you've done it once, you're an expert. Well, I think there's a little bit of an arrogance in our culture about that kind of thing in general, that we think if we know a little, we know a lot. Yeah. But I think we have to humble ourselves and be patient. People want to be a shaman or something. I once went to a Native American church ceremony where they were honoring some of the they call them roadmen in that context. And the guy who was running the meeting, said to the group in the morning, which is when people express themselves generally after the long night of work. And he said, "Hey, relatives, you don't want to be a shaman. You don't want to be a roadman." He said, "You don't choose it. It chooses you. And if it does choose you, it's an arduous path. You will have responsibilities for the rest of your life, to your community, to your people." I think perhaps there are people around that are taking this idea of being a shaman or an ayahuasquero or whatever probably much too lightly. And again, as I mentioned a few moments ago, perhaps not having done enough of their own inner work to avoid misusing it, as well as not understanding the depths of the spirit connection and all that kind of thing. I don't know if I can think of any other particular problems associated with these things. I would say careful to buy your stuff on the internet. There's a lot of, there's no guarantee. This is one of the things that Native people are saying these days that to me that I'm hearing, in conversation is, or Indigenous people in Canada and so on, is try to pay attention to the source of any medicine that you're working with, even things like sage, like if you want to try to work with sage, for smudging and healing, try to be aware of where it came from and who grew it and what was their attitude about it. I had a previous book, Cannabis and Spirituality, and some of the people in that book talked about how, there was one guy who was a grower, and he said people were always amazed at what's with this medicine. It's like no other cannabis I've ever smoked before. And he said, well, that's because I put an immense amount of love into these plants from the moment, through the whole process, the water I give them, what I sing and say to them every day, and so on and so on. And, I don't know if there's good science for this, but people like him say the end user's experience is different when the plant is grown with love. And then also just, the whole notion of reciprocity, which is a big one for Indigenous people these days, like giving back respectfully and in various other ways, So, I could probably come up with a couple more problems, but maybe I should leave it there.
No, it's solid. I just think you've done such a good job of getting this overview. I mean, so much of what we're not able to hit, and I hear we need to finish in a bit, but that you gave the book for anybody out there who will purchase this book. There's a solid tip of the hat to the lineage of psychedelics in this culture. Of course, looking at Hoffman and Wasson and Leary and Richard Alpert, all these luminaries, or Andrew Weil,
that were involved, and up to Schultes and even the ethnobotanists from the 30s and the 40s. That's this column of discovery that we're having to go elsewhere, go to foreign lands to, on some level, repair what we dropped. Because what I'm hearing you say is it's not that psychedelics are necessarily going to heal us. It's that the fact that our culture kicked out this divine inheritance because we've removed these sacramental substances and ceremonies from our culture, we are sick. And
Yeah,
so,
and not just that, and this could open up another half hour of conversation easily. But I've also been interested in this kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, an idea, or maybe it's a historical fact. I don't know. There's people have addressed it in different ways. Have you ever heard of John Lamb Lash? I think his name is John Lamb Lash. He has an amazing book. Actually, I've forgotten the title of it right now, but he did an incredible amount of research on how the ancient mystery schools that often did involve the medicines. He didn't focus on the medicines particularly, but he focused on the mystery schools of the pre-Christian era. Were all obliterated by the dominant mentality. All through Europe, through the Levant, through Asia, as to some degree. He starts off this book. The book is called "Not in His Image." I forget the subtitle.
what a good title.
Yeah. It's from 2006, but it's very relevant. And this guy did an amazing amount of primary source research, and it's surprising how much there is written in those times, that can still be, dragged out of obscure, dusty library shelves and whatnot. Anyway, he starts off the book by, I think it was in around about 424 of the Common Era, a woman named Hypatia. She was a revered figure in Alexandria in Egypt, and she was a representative of the mystery schools. She was attacked and slaughtered by a mob, and he makes that the kind of the marker point for the final death blow of the mystery schools. But he talks a lot about how prior to that, these pagan cultures throughout much of the old world, if you will, were doing just fine, thank you. They didn't have a hierarchy. They didn't have sexual repression. They had access to medicines of different kinds and so on, and they were gradually obliterated over time by the Holy Roman Church and the Roman Empire and so on and so on. Perhaps one of the biggest greatest metaphors of all is the Temple of Eleusis and the Eleusinian mysteries that went on for, I don't know, 2,000 years or so. Yeah. And all the great figures of Athens went there. Not Picasso, the Plato's and the Socrates and all these people went there for this initiation, which by all accounts involved a psychedelic sacrament, the kykeon or whatever you call it, and so essentially it influenced all these people who influenced some of our thinking even today. But that temple was literally built right over top of the next culture. I'm not quite sure if it was the Romans or whoever, built right on top of it. And so all those cultures were destroyed. And so then I want to bring in Philip K. Dick. You know who he is, don't you?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So he's a
good territory.
Oh yeah, he's a real out there guy. Was. So do we have time for a little story about Philip?
Please. Yes. I like where you're going.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure how old he was. Maybe in his 40s. This might have been in the 60s or so. I'm not quite sure. He had a breakdown, like a complete sort of nervous breakdown of some sort or another. A number of things had conspired to create that. He'd been through some messy divorce. He had a 5-year-old child who with an undiagnosable illness. He had been misprescribed a schizophrenia medicine or an antipsychotic he wasn't supposed to get or something like that. Anyway, he had this breakdown, and he spent 3 days in a completely altered state, and then another, I forget now, month or 2 or 3 in a level of that altered state. And during those first 3 days especially, but continuing, all these remarkable things started to happen, like strange things, like his completely healthy parrot just kicked over and died on its perch. He got a diagnosis of his son's illness, which he told the doctors about, and turned out to be the correct diagnosis, which resulted in the healing of his son. And he started downloading what he called a vast active living information system. And his next book was a novelized or fictionalized version of that, and it's called Valis, V-A-L-I-S. And what he was downloading, he said, was this sort of Gnostic information. And the way that Dick talked about it is that, and Elaine Pagels in her book, The Gnostic Gospels, also talks about this from a different perspective, is that, round about the time following after the time of Jesus in the next 100 or 2 years or so, there was a kind of a battle for the dominance of ideas and how they impacted culture between the Orthodox and the Gnostics. The Gnostics, this is a gross simplification. I'm not the researcher expert on this whatsoever, but as I think of it, if you want to simplify it down, the Gnostics tended to be the mystics sort of idea. They didn't. I think I remember hearing them say that it didn't mean anything to call yourself a Christian unless you were initiated, unless you'd actually had the experience, which might be the medicine, for example, right? Whereas the Orthodox were the ones that ended up winning that battle, as the power hungry and the control freaks of the world have always done up until now in general, and obliterated to the best of their ability any reference even to the Gnostics. And in fact, we probably wouldn't even know anything about them at all if it weren't for the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library by some Egyptian teenager. And those documents have been verified by, the most thorough professional researchers to, carbon date them and confirm that the way that I think it was Aramaic maybe language was used in the books, was the way it was being used at that time. And so there's this idea that up until now, the control freaks have always won because they're trying harder. They want to control. The ones who are interested in experience, they're not trying to gain control over other people, so they don't try as hard and they don't win in that sense. And so we've had, I think Dick called it the dark or the black emperor or something, or the demiurge, the false god. Lamb Lash talks about that as well. That Christianity has been dominated by what he calls the demiurge, the false god who thinks he's God, so to speak, right? And so Dick talks about that as well. I think he calls it the Black Emperor. And in Dick's idea, if I remember, this is really loosey-goosey. Sorry, John, because I haven't read this book for 20 years, but I think he talks about how basically things just kind of stopped about 2,000 years ago, Just a lid got put on the spiritual evolution of much of humanity. Certainly all the ones that could be within the reach of those people, which is why the indigenous people oftentimes do still have threads of things to share with us, because they didn't necessarily get taken over in the same way, and certainly not until more recently for the most part, right? But the key about all that is, and Dick said this too, he said that's lifting now. One of the contributors to the book, Bruce Damer, who's also spoken at the conference, our conference, and will again speak at our conference this year. He gave a talk at our conference a few years ago using the metaphor of the reopening of the temple. So he talked about Eleusis and how it was built right over top, and how that was kind of not only a historical, factual thing that happened, but also a metaphor for what happened to the mystery schools and the pagan sort of more freer cultures and so on, spiritually connected and unified, so to speak. Um, and that, the work, you might say, the karmic point and the work now is the reopening of the temple, of wisdom, of reality, of unconditional reality, so to speak. And, just to drum it in one last time, I'll say that the psychedelics are here for that reason. You asked that question. Some people would even say that they themselves, the spirits of those plants, are kind of coming in and saying, "Hey, folks, you're not getting it fast enough. We're going to help you. We're going to give you these medicines. The medicines themselves don't heal you. You heal you. But these medicines work with your systems in a way that allows you to open up to the potential."
And then show up with everybody else in the world with love, acceptance, and forgiveness, and bring that experience into your mundane daily existence.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, if you don't, then one might say that you didn't learn the lessons that the medicines were trying to teach you. Tyson Yunkaporta has a lovely bit on that. He doesn't think you need to do these medicines a lot. He said I can't remember if it's in the chapter or in my interview with him. He said that about 15 years ago, he had a really powerful San Pedro cactus, or also known as Huachuma, experience. He said, I learned so much in that was like a 12-hour journey, that I don't think I ever need to do that again in my whole life. He said, I've got a lifetime's work of instruction. It taught me what I didn't understand about women, about life altogether. And in fact, in his book, Sand Talk, he has these little symbols that are like little icon or whatever, little graphic things that are put in here and there. Mm-hmm. And he said he was shown those symbols during that San Pedro journey, and then later, years later, was actually taught them by an old, wisdom master who said, okay, I'm going to show you these symbols. And Tyson's going, wow, I saw those in my San Pedro journey years ago, right? So I love his chapter in the book. He says, before you go anywhere, cavorting across the cosmos in great splendor with your medicines, understand something. You need to understand the rock beneath your feet. You need to understand your connection to the earth and to the community that you're involved in. And if you don't, you're not going to be given the responsibilities that these medicines can bestow upon you to do the work. And that's what I think you're talking about, John, is that, that the healing of oneself is just the first step. Really, if it doesn't, I like the metaphor of like working on your car or having a car, you have to make the car roadworthy, but you don't have to spend the rest of your life tiddling with it, in the garage and polishing it every day. That becomes too narcissistic. You've missed the point. The point is that car can take you somewhere. Well, for some people, it's just the beauty of the car, and that's okay too. But, I think the metaphor serves anyway, I hope, that the purpose of the car is to get you from A to B, and the purpose of healing yourself is to participate in the healing of the planet. There's a little saying, heal yourself to heal the world, right?
Amen, man.
Yeah.
Well, let's start to close our time out today, and I'm wondering what threads are still out there that you want to fold into our conversation before we finish up.
John, I feel like it's been almost 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I've never been interviewed for this long, and I don't think I've ever talked for this long either. So I don't think I really have anything to add. Maybe, if I have to add a summation point, maybe it would be, hey folks, please believe in the possibility of possibility. Maybe there's a divine reality which we've all been hiding from for one reason or another. We've all been afraid of. But I have this lovely little book still on my shelf from way back in the 70s called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. And one of the things he says in that book is, go beyond reason to love. It is safe. It is the only safety. You know? So recognizing that that's our true nature, that we're afraid to trust life. And I speak for myself just as much as anybody else. I wouldn't make any ridiculous claims to be enlightened or anything like that. I'm just on the path, but I've had enough glimpses to know that, there's a there, as Yogi Berra might say, and it's here. It's just something we, as Buddhists would say, we can land on. It's not an add-on in a sense. It's a takeaway, you might say, learning to surrender, learning to trust. I had a period about 3-4 years ago where that word kept coming up when I do medicine journeys and just in general, like trust with a capital T. It's kind of like central, can we relax? Can we trust that if we don't build this wall of protection around ourselves, we won't be destroyed, or what will be destroyed will be what we didn't want anyway. That we can fall into landing on, again, what my Buddhist teacher used to call what is, and we can trust that. That's the journey. And then everything else, in a sense, takes care of itself. If we actually can do that, then we don't really need to, well, maybe this might be worth saying. As a metaphor, Ken Littlefish, the roadman I mentioned earlier, he said, relatives, stay behind the medicine. And what he meant by that is, the medicine is the teaching of the spirit, but it's a metaphor that if you get in front of it, that's your ego, that's you enforcing your ideas upon things and not trusting what Stephen Herod Buhner called the golden thread, or I think William Blake initially first said that one. I think he might have called it the golden something or other, or silver thread or something. But the idea that if we can learn to trust ourselves in that sense, and the divine reality, if you will, that's the state of peace and so on, then things fall into place. We just follow the golden thread. It's a humbling of ourselves, and so the true journey, the true awakening, healing journey. Pardon me, I'm getting choked up about this actually. Takes care of itself, and so you don't even need to really worry about. In fact, worry altogether is a problem, but you don't need to worry about how you'll do that, because you'll follow the golden thread. You'll do what's natural to you. You'll use your talents, your compassion will guide you. You will care about the world. My old Buddhist teacher used to say, allowing yourself to be touched by the world, and he said, the awakened mind is a mind of joy and sadness mixed together. Sadness for the world, sadness for the tragedy of the fact that we're surrounded by the divine light all the time, right? And we're just afraid of it. We just have to learn to trust it. I think I better stop there.
That is a great place.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I can tell that feeling is underneath this whole book. So thank you for your time, and of course extending yourself, your introversion beyond your perceived limits. But it's a joy to talk to you and to read your words. And
thank you.
Yeah.
How did you know I was introverted?
Yeah.
I used to be. I got two sides to me. I've kind of got the public side, but I was a really shy kid. Yeah.
I interact with a lot of introverts all the time. Those that are closest to me tend to be introverted. I'm a shotgun blast of extroverted feeling. Much love, Stephen.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and thanks for your interest and for keeping the conversation alive with a whole bunch of questions that I and probably some people, a lot of people could have done a more detailed and thorough job, but each one of a number of your topics could have been like an hour discussion in themselves. And so, I hope I've done some justice to some of these themes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Control.